Without further ado, let us welcome Mr. Peter Hitchens back into the Independent Republic. Peter, very good morning to you.
A very good morning to you too, and a blessed Easter to you.
Well, indeed, it's been quite a strange Easter, hasn't it?
Very strange.
But, you know, Boris Johnson being resurrected on Sunday, I suppose, was entirely in keeping with the narrative at the moment.
I think, actually, in so many ways, I don't think I'll join in that particular form of levity, if you forgive me.
No, fair enough.
We're all pleased that the Prime Minister is recovering.
Think so.
I think I'd say that for certain, and I'm very pleased that he is recovering, and of course, all our sympathies go to those families and individuals which have been affected by disease at what would otherwise be a hopeful time. Absolutely
right. Let's see whether we can start with a question by me to you about things that may have changed since we spoke last Monday. You were particularly talking about various countries that have performed better than we had. We're seeing in Sweden now perhaps a little bit of a tighter situation happening. We're seeing in South Korea that things may not always be as they seem. I shall say to you now that I made a mistake by saying to you that the death rate in Japan was very high, which it isn't. So I got that wrong. However, it may become higher than it currently is. And it also looks as though in Spain, the lockdown may be beginning to be lifted. So what are your observations from the past few days?
Well, I continue to say what I said from the start, which is that there is no evidence at all that these economic shutdowns and attacks on personal liberty actually reduce the incidence of death from COVID-19. There's a very interesting piece, in fact, which anyone can study on the web today by Yinon Weiss, which I don't know. Those with great mathematical skills may disagree with it, but it certainly posits the fact that you can't find any correlation, particularly in the United States, which he studied in detail, between the onset of shutdowns and the death rates in the various states involved, and a similar attempt to correlate it with school closures doesn't work either. And this is what I've said from the start, but the presumption that's made in this debate by those in favor of the shutdown is that the shutdown will save lives, and therefore those who oppose it are callous about human life. And this isn't so. It is a presumption. And again, there's a second fascinating article by Professor John Lee in the Spectator under the title of "Understanding COVID Needs Open Minds and Vigorous Debate," in which he also attacks this presumption that the shutdown will lead to fewer deaths. We simply don't have any information from any of these countries to suggest that it is in itself effective. I would say that if looking at Sweden, the last figures from Sweden before the Easter break really got underway with 17 had died. I've urged caution on those figures because at holiday times the collection of such figures is always difficult. So let's wait and see. But what certainly doesn't seem to have happened in Sweden so far, and one must add so far to anything one says, is the huge number of deaths which would have been predicted if one had been using the Imperial College model. Absolutely nothing remotely resembling it. So I think that we are in a position where, at the moment, all the governments in Europe are beginning to wonder whether they got this right. And I think what many people need to read is the fascinating article in the Daily Telegraph last Friday, I think, by Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator, which plainly came as a result of some extremely high-level briefings in which he made it clear that the government was deeply split about what to do next and had been astonished by just how effective its appeal to the public had been, and has in a way created a monster. That is to say, we have an immensely well-intentioned and self-disciplined public in this country who, having been persuaded by the government of this great peril, has behaved with extraordinary self-control over the past 3 weeks, and has also accepted without question an economic shutdown which is costing the equivalent of £2.4 billion a day. That's 6 modern new general hospitals a day,
yes,
if you like to put it that way.
Right.
Accepting that, and the government is increasingly doubtful as to whether it's actually done the right thing, but it's created such strong public support for the action that it's very difficult for them to now climb down. And,
well, right.
But you note that in Italy, which has been where it's been suggested that the shutdown has been a rational response and that it's been very serious, that in Italy and in Spain, the governments are again beginning to grope for ways to at least sidle out of the position into which they've got themselves because of the colossal economic and social damage
Yes.
which is
Can
being done.
I just pop in there?
No, that's where I was going to stop.
All
So,
right.
that's my main statement. After that, let's just keep it a brief exchange.
Yes, absolutely. Here's a couple of things that I would say about that. I was talking to a doctor this morning, and I asked him, why is it, do you think, that Britain's death rate is as high as it is? Because it is unusually high compared to other countries. He said he believes it's because of the fact that Britain is quite a crowded country compared to a place like Sweden, where there are fewer people around. And he also said, as Boris Johnson did when he left hospital yesterday, that, you know, staying away from each other, social distancing, is the way to stop this virus from spreading so quickly that it overwhelms the NHS. And that's basically why they're doing it. And they say that people can go out, but they cannot crowd around each other. They cannot have mass meetings. They cannot go to football matches, all that sort of thing. But he also said that what we now know is that if somebody sneezes with this virus, it can literally hang in the air for 3 hours, you know. So the only seemingly straight answer for me to get past this is to have a long enough period of time where people are literally not going about their daily business and they are only going outside for essential work and essential, you know, food shopping and that kind of thing. Because if we don't do that, I think it will never stop spreading.
Well, can I offer some counters to all those points?
Yeah.
First of all, in Sweden, yes, of course, if you simply take population versus square mileage, it's not as crowded as Britain. But friends of mine who live in Sweden will point out that it is a very urbanized country, and that certainly in Stockholm particularly, the density of population is quite comparable to that in London. So I don't think that argument particularly works. On the overstretching of the NHS, it's very interesting. Again, I've tried to get information from people I know who work in the NHS, and what they say is that what's happened now is that so much of the NHS estate has been turned over to effectively intensive care provision that almost the whole of the rest of the NHS is not functioning at all. People are not going to hospitals, they're not calling doctors, and many things are not being done. So I'm not entirely sure what the pressure is on the NHS. One of the consequences of this is that the normal published statistics on the usage and pressure on intensive care are not being published. I think there is a reasonable, unsinister reason for this, which is, as I say, it simply isn't comparable because of the huge amount of emergency intensive care provision which has now been set up, so they wouldn't really mean very much. But I think that if we did have, or could have any measure of what was going on, I'm not sure that this argument that intensive care was under colossal, unsustainable pressure would stand up. And then again, we get back to the same old point. There is still no evidence that the shutdown measures are actually affecting the numbers dying. The other thing about the British, and indeed some of the other national figures for coronavirus deaths, remains at the point originally made, again, by Dr. John Lee. What are we actually measuring? Are we measuring people who have died from coronavirus, or are we measuring people who have died who have actually been infected with coronavirus, or have been, in some cases, presumed to be infected with coronavirus? And if we are, then how reliable are these measures? As far as I've been able to discover, and I'm not a statistical genius, and I fully admit this, trying to find out the number of deaths over and above what they would normally be expected to be at this time of year on a 5-year average, it seems to be, as far as I can discover, again, about 1,000 a week. That's roughly 144 per day. Now, this is obviously tragic in every case, and to be mourned and regretted, as all avoidable and indeed unavoidable deaths are. But it's not enormous.
No, I get that.
It's not at the stage of pandemic which we're being told about.
Yeah, but this is one of the difficulties, I think, with all of the figures that we're looking at, because none of us are statisticians. The people who are the statisticians are looking at them. For example, I saw, I don't know whether you did on Twitter, some stats from Statista on the deaths per million in various countries. And in fact, the UK stands at 92.53. But 4 countries much worse than that, 5 actually, the Netherlands, Switzerland, France, Belgium and Italy and Spain are all much worse in deaths per million. But the problem is, I think, Peter, you're right to call attention to who is being said to have died of coronavirus, because I think every country in the world is doing it a different way.
That is true.
We're hearing it from South Korea, for example, now, that they think that they are the patients who are becoming reinfected with coronavirus are not necessarily being reinfected, but they're actually, the virus is just kind of reappearing rather than coming back again. So what's happened there is they think that their testing system was wrong. So it may well be, and you're also right to say, you know, wait and see, because we just can't be sure, really, I think is the problem.
Well, I think the limit of our knowledge is the limit of our ability to discuss it or make policy. But I think we have to recognise here that the spread of viruses, as the fact which you produced earlier on about the effect of the sneeze, the spread of viruses is such an astonishingly potent thing, especially in an advanced urban society, that attempts by the state to control it are much like an attempt by the state to calm the Atlantic Ocean in a storm. We simply don't have as much power as we think we do over these things. And so what there is no evidence of is that we've been able to exercise that power. Now, in that case, we have to look again at the proportionality of the measures which the government has been undertaking. And I think the government is doing this. One of the papers, I know that Matt Hancock denied this at a government press conference, which baffles me. But one of the things that has been considered at a cabinet committee and has been sourced, and I've checked this out, to a minister who's seen it, is a suggestion, certainly a projection, and projections, as we know, are not to be relied upon as fact, that as many as 150,000 people might die as a result of the shutdown measures that we've taken. Now, this is an immense number of people, and so again, I have to stress this isn't a matter of lives versus money. It is a matter of lives versus lives, that there are different effects on human life from different policies, and the policy being followed by the government has its dangers to life as well. So in judging whether we should continue that policy or whether we should quietly slip out of it and moderate it and bring the economy back to life before too much damage is done, I think we need to consider that point.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. But as far as the kind of the next step is concerned, would you feel perhaps slightly more encouraged by the fact that other countries are beginning to look at lifting the restrictions? Because if we can see an end game, and we can see perhaps if 11 weeks is the given amount of time that this takes to get through the system, which is what we're supposed to have learned from China, but as we both agreed last week, we don't really know if we can believe China. But say it is 11 weeks, and say the Spanish lift their lockdown, but say the Danish lift theirs, other countries start to do the same thing. There will be something sort of, almost sort of evidential that we can learn.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I would certainly, it's not for me to do anything which might discourage the government from beginning to moderate these measures, because I fear greatly for, as we discussed last week again, for the small businesses, for the people losing their jobs, for the people facing wage cuts, and for the very many damaging things which people face when we do eventually return to something like normal in terms of higher taxes, lower standards of living, and everything else, which I think are very much coming our way and will be worse the longer this goes on. And I would not want to shout and scream, oh, you're in retreat at the government, because I would very much like them to retreat, and I would like to give them an honourable way out of what seems to me to have been a mistake. But in return, I would not want anybody to start claiming that the measures have actually been the cause of the eventual decline in coronavirus infections, which I think we will see. Because, as I say, there is no evidence of this. And I return to my metaphor. The patient goes to the doctor with chickenpox. The doctor says, if I cut off your right leg, then it will go away. He cuts off his right leg, the chickenpox goes away. The doctor says, there, you see, I was right. But in fact, there's no connection between the cutting off of the leg and the chickenpox going away. But I don't want, I will not do anything to discourage the government by any kind of saying, look, they've made a mistake, look, silly fools.
Yes.
To prevent the shutdown from being moderated, because I wish to see it moderated.
But people...
on the other hand, I do not think that at the end of it, without any causal or even correlative evidence, that the government or anybody else should claim that this shutdown has led to the decline in coronavirus infections.
But as I said to you last week, I don't believe that the reasoning for the shutdown is to prevent death that is going to happen when people get the disease. What it's there to do, and what other countries have said it's there to do, is to try and relieve any pressure that might overwhelm the NHS. And that appears to have been successful up to now, because we get reports now from around the country that the NHS is coping. It is under pressure, but it is actually coping. And what we can say is that, therefore, if people were dying simply because there wasn't enough equipment for them to actually, be given, for example, oxygen or ventilators because there were just too many of them, then it has worked.
Well, I don't agree, because it's the same argument, really. The argument as to whether the shutdown prevents infection is the same as the argument about whether it prevents death. Does the shutdown in itself hamper or inhibit or slow or stop the spread of infection of COVID-19? I don't think there's any evidence this is so. And until there is, I don't think anybody should claim that these actions have caused whatever may now happen. Of course, we don't know what viruses operate very strangely, and they're affected by all kinds of things, including changes in the weather, for instance. So we don't know what will happen next. But I simply don't think people should claim that they have done something when they have no evidence they've done so.
No, sure.
If these infections are reducing and if deaths are reducing, then let us all rejoice enormously, because that is good for everybody. But let us not make claims that can't be substantiated.
Now, a lot of the people that have enjoyed our little jousts on Twitter and on here as well, and again, I thank you, Peter, for doing it, and I think we should do it again next Monday, by the way.
I think I'd be delighted to do that. Yeah.
And we've found a way of talking to each other without interrupting as well, which I'm very happy about. Here's the thing. If, for example, the question that a lot of people have asked me over the course of the weekend is, please ask Peter Hitchens what he would have done differently to what this government has done, because what you seem to be suggesting is that if you had not locked down the economy and allowed the economy to continue, that would have been an improvement. But it could have cost a lot more lives, surely.
Well, it could have done, but as I say, there's no evidence that it could have done, and that is why I continue to say that I would follow the Swedish example. That is, say, taking modest, practical measures without shutting down the entire economy and without forcing people into isolation. If you look at what's happened in Sweden, they have not done nothing by any manner of means. So, for instance, the senior members of the royal family are in social isolation.
Yeah.
And if you go to a bar in Sweden, you can't go up to the bar. You have to wait to be served at the table, and people are, in many cases, staying well clear of each other. But it's not been done in the same, how shall I put it, very stringent manner here. I don't think there's been any scenes of policemen banging down people's doors or telling them not to go for walks in the country or whatever it is that we've had here. It's been a good deal more level-headed.
Yes.
And although the Swedish economy has, as all economies are at the moment, I would add, although the Swedish economy has undoubtedly undergone a reduction in activity, it's nothing like as much as the reduction.
No,
the enormous public spending.
But they are very much.
We don't have, which we're engaging on here.
No, but they are very much out on their own there, aren't they? Because they're maybe one of a handful of countries that have done that. Very few countries have done that.
Well,
in fact, in South Korea, they're now in South Korea attaching wristbands to people to make sure that they adhere to the quarantine that they're in.
Well, I don't know particularly. I haven't looked very much at South Korea lately because its problems, to a great extent, by comparison with ours, have been in the past up till now. There may be something in the future one doesn't know. I know a bit about Sweden. I know a bit about the Netherlands. Both countries in which the direction taken by Britain had not been taken. Of course, one knows a bit about Japan as well, where
Yes.
there's been a noisy adoption of a supposed state of emergency, which doesn't actually have any particularly stringent provisions attached to it.
But the Netherlands...
And let's say, I think now that we have... and last week when we spoke, and I'm very grateful to you, by the way, for correcting what you said last
Yes.
week, because it's really good when people admit.
I wanted to do it.
What we had at that time was that 99 people had died.
Yeah.
So 85 people had died
Yes.
in Japan out of a population of 127 million. It's now 135.
Yeah.
And these figures do not suggest that there is any connection between a stringent policy and a lower number of deaths.
That's true. However,
we have to face this.
Yes, but however, on Wednesday, after we spoke on Monday, they put much of the cities of Japan under emergency measures and declared a state of emergency.
Well, as I say, that state of emergency is largely symbolic and empty. The actual provisions of it are extremely weak.
Well, they're not extremely weak, but what I'm saying is they've recognised that something has to change. But in terms of the Netherlands, right, I said to you earlier that our deaths per million ratio is 92.53. The Netherlands is 121.93. So there's more.
I think you'll find that the Belgium next door is quite similar.
It's even worse.
But the thing about Belgium is that Belgium has had a very stringent shutdown, whereas the Netherlands hasn't.
I think there must be something
whatever it is that's causing these differences. It's not the stringency of the shutdown, and that remains my consistent point.
Okay.
There's no evidence that shutdown does any good. There's a great deal of evidence that it costs a huge amount and damages greatly the economies involved. And again, I come back to my original argument from the very start. Have our actions been in proportion to the danger, and have they been rational? I say not. In the answer to your listeners' questions, I would have followed the Swedish position. And I think the Swedish position has been wise. I think it's the Swedish position which has been normal. It's been all the other governments in the world which have taken measures unprecedented in human history. I mean, never before have we imposed quarantine on the healthy.
No.
Even during the great
But-
so-called Spanish influenza of 1918, the quarantining was done on the ill, not on the healthy.
Yes, but the quarantining in 1918 was a very different kettle of fish, surely.
I don't disagree.
Because
I'm just saying
nowadays,
it's a different principle.
Right.
Quarantining the healthy is a different principle from quarantining the sick.
yes, no, I agree with that. But the point is that we have a very different world now. I mean, one thing we've learned is that the pandemic spread of this disease was done entirely, and some people have made this argument over the weekend, because of the cheap cost of flying around the world. And so many people from China were in all sorts of other parts of the world spreading the disease that could probably never have happened in sort of a century ago.
What was happening then was the very large numbers of people, particularly in the United States, were coming back from the European War. And so a lot of the figures that we have on the spread of influenza in 1918 come from that. And of course, there is an argument that they largely affect those cities on the East Coast, which first felt the arrival of the returning soldiers. In those days, people didn't fly back from Europe to San Francisco. They took the ship back to the East Coast, and then they took trains back across the country. So a lot of the interesting figures which are produced for that era reflect that as much as anything else.
Sure. Now, we didn't want to take a break while we were talking, so we've left that until the end, I'm afraid. So I've just been told that we're pretty much out of time. But I think this has been very helpful. I think it's been educational. I hope that you've enjoyed it. And I think the point is, Peter, that we don't know enough yet to be able to know whether this shutdown was a good idea or a bad idea. But I'd still rather be safe than sorry, as I said to you last week.
Yes, but as I said to you last week, what are you safe from? The economic damage of shutting down an economy, destroying so many jobs and small businesses, and of spending so much money we haven't got is a huge threat to human well-being and health. We're not safe. This isn't a safe policy which we're following.
Okay. Well, thank you again. We'll talk to you next week. Peter Hitchens there talking from his position on the lockdown. He doesn't think it's a good idea. He still doesn't think it's a good idea, but some things have changed. Some things will change. We'll talk to him some more a week from now. This is Talk Radio.